Hi, everyone. It is Jamie here with Kendra and Daniela, and we're excited to dive in to another discoverable. Well, really recognizing that storytelling is actually just a vehicle. It's a way to really unearth the values, the identity, and the passions, trying to find out what's there in the community. So, just to reflect on this slide for a moment and situate ourselves in the big picture, we are starting with discovery. We're going into the community and we're just kind of walking with them and facilitating a process where we can really unearth what is there and moving towards piling up assets and opportunities onto the table by which we can connect them together and then mobilize for change. And so that's the process that we're on. It's not um, and there might be two steps forward, one step back, and a little bit of misdirection. But for the most part, this is the way we kind of the journey that we're sort of walking on. And so here you can just see what we're looking at today, the historical capacity, all of the power and the opportunity that's available. But we have to reflect back and look at where our communities come from. And then you can kind of see where we're going in the discovery process. So I want you to think about how you go into the community. And I like using this metaphor of a miner or an excavator. It's a person that goes in and you're looking for treasure in the earth. It could be iron or, coltan, something you use to make cell phones with. It could be gold or silver, precious metals. And all of this stuff is unseen because it's buried. And, traditionally, a miner would go in with a headlamp, hands would be free, and use an axe. And so we want to think about what does that look like to go into a community with a headlamp and you're looking into kind of the dark corners and into the earth where things are unseen. And then you're using your pickaxe to excavate, to really dig in and pull out the things that are there. And a pickaxe is one tool, and really, this course, this learning content that we're giving you, we're actually giving you lots and lots of different tools. And so all of these exercises and activities that we're giving you and talking about, think of them as kind of almost different versions of a pickaxe, different tools to unearth things that one tool might work differently or work better in a different area. And it's really up to you to look in the toolbox and kind of discern what's best for every particular situation. There's a couple things I want to mention about this excavating, this mining. One thing is you're looking for kind of the raw material. Raw material is just like maybe you dig up a rock, and inside of that rock is some gold, but you have to pull it out and you have to process it, and it has to be refined. And so it's not just enough to pull something out, it's just a rock. But part of the process is to put it on the table and start to think about what is it useful for and who can help us refine this rock, maybe turn it into, a golden ring or coltan and iron and different metals that when you bring the right people together, you can create computers and cell phones and parts for cars and things like that. And so part of that is to look at something and recognize this is not just a rock, but it's something that's very useful for a community. And that's why we have to continue to walk with the community. And this is a slow process, building trust, building connections between people. So every community has a story, and it has more than one story. And so it's a history of challenges and resilience, overcoming things, people coming together, different beliefs and different traditions. How have they worked together in the past? And they have stories about times when they've connected their gifts and moved into action. And the stories themselves are not the asset, but it's a way to unlock something. And that's something really where this is going towards is finding meaning, finding purpose. Why are we here? What has God put us in this place for? And it's also a way to unlock identity. Who are we? What is unique about me in this community? What is unique about our community, maybe our culture, that God can utilize and turn that into opportunities? You know, one of the problems with stories, and I think you'll find this in your community, in the communities that you work with, is that they often get lost. Maybe they don't get retold, or maybe they're not remembered correctly. And often what happens is they can get pushed aside by a more powerful story. And that's why we always talk about the danger of the single story, because a community is not just one story. And so we have to be aware of the importance of drawing out stories. And it means a lot of pushing and a lot of whacking and hitting with the axe till we can really get those positive stories out. I want to share one story that maybe some of you have heard, and it comes from Bukavu in Eastern Congo. We had done a timeline, and we're going to get to that in a few minutes here. But in this church, and you can see some of the people here, they had really been hardened and wearied by a difficult burden of trying to survive amidst conflict and poverty. And we done a timeline with them, and during this timeline, people were telling stories. And one elder in the community stood up in the back and said, "Could I share a story about the history of this church?" And he told an amazing story that was very inspiring. 10 years earlier, there was 3 Mennonite denominations in the West. And they realized in the east of the country, where this community was, there was conflict. But because they were Mennonite churches, they said, "We are the peace church. God's called us to go there." So they sent 3 families, one each from each denomination, into the conflict zone. And during that time, God was so faithful to them. And actually, from that point, those 3 families grew into 7 churches. So he told the story, and afterwards I asked about 30 or 40 people in the congregation, "Has anyone heard that story?" And very few people had. It was just an example of how these valuable, important, powerful stories don't get retold, and they don't get internalized in a way that is truly powerful. So it turns out the story was a starting point whereby the community began to recognize the significance of their calling. God had put them there in that community, not just to survive, but actually to make an impact. So is it possible in your community or the communities that you're working with that valuable stories have been lost, not retold, not remembered in the way that God wants them to be remembered? Or valuable stories are known, but they haven't been processed properly. They've been taken from just a rock into something, some kind of metal that is fabricated to be useful and to be impactful in the community. And so that's just a bit of introduction on the importance of stories and how we need to utilize them strategically. And so we're going to talk about some exercises, how to really pull them out more. So I'll turn it over to Daniela.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why some of these stories have been lost is because it is actually an art. It is actually a practice to remember. And it actually requires us to do something because it's super easy for us to forget. And actually, the act of forgetting is not an act of will. It actually just happens. We just forget, right? And in order for us to remember, we need to practice it. And I think about our family stories and how us as a family reflect on the past. And that's what gives our family an identity and some meaning, is because we're always sharing stories with each other about the things that we've done and the things that meant something to us. And in the Bible, it's actually considered a biblical practice, this act of remembering. And there are so many scriptural references where the Lord asks us to remember. You know, he did so in Exodus when they were crossing the Jordan River and they were about to enter into the promised land. And the Lord said to the people, I want you to take these stones, 12 stones, one from each tribe, and place them here by the river. And when you do that, I want you to remember what you have done. I want you to remember what I've done for you, how I took you out of slavery and I've brought you through, and I'm bringing you into this hopeful future as a people. So that's just one of the times in the Bible that the Lord asked the people to remember. Another one is the practice of Passover. And this ended up being a tradition that continued on for all of the Old Testament, because it was a requirement in the practice, the way that it was carried out, that parents had to tell their children about God's great act of saving grace in bringing his people out of Egypt, and as a means of judgment too against the Egyptians. And anyways, this idea of practicing this over and over again is a reminder of the story of our the saving story in the Bible. And there's other things that we also do. We do things like communion, where we think about what Jesus did for us. And there's all these different things of remembering promises. And in the Newer Testament, it becomes something that becomes a discipline in our life of remembering, giving thanks. We talk about that all the time, that gratitude is a practice of remembering what has been done for us. And we're called to do that. It's really hard to do this because we are really in a culture of being in the moment, and that's totally understandable. We're trying to get food on the table. We're trying to pay our bills. We're trying to get our kids to school. We're trying to do all these things to make our livelihood happen. And then you add things like the phone, where you've got reels and you've got sound bites and everything is quick, quick, quick and in the moment. But we miss out on this wealth of history, this wealth of hindsight and wisdom from the past when we don't take time to remember it. We are story people. We are narrative people. We live and we embody all kinds of stories that give us meaning, that shape us, that inform how we live. So when we take the time to practice this, to remember rightly, then we actually are able to think into the future. We're actually able to hope. And it gives us this orientation that motivates us to bring us into our future. Now, all of these different tools that we're going to be doing and all of these different discoverables, they all illuminate or shed light onto those principles that we've talked about in the past, the community-centered development principles. And so you're probably already knowing and anticipating what principles this discoverable sheds light on. And I think you can kind of tell that this one is really emphasizing the organic principle, which says that the power and the blueprint for community growth lies within the community itself. As we take time to remember and practice this, we locate and celebrate all the functional aspects of our community and its history of resilience and creativity. And our community is then able to recognize its unique personality and rediscover what is possible. So for this discoverable, we're going to be teaching you how to use 3 tools that help facilitate communal storytelling. And Kendra's going to talk a little bit about stories and get us into our first tool.
Thank you, Daniela. As Daniela is talking about the art of remembering, this idea of remembering pulls us out of false stories and back into a true story. Actually, the stories that we believe, we're a part of going back generations in our community, it informs our identity and it shapes how we live. And we all know that this is true. We can see the effects of it in our lives. Um, a quick story to illustrate this. A couple of months ago, I was spending time with the Choctaw Nation, which is an indigenous community here in the United States. They have a painful history of relocation. Their people were forcefully removed from their native lands and forced to migrate to another part of what is now the United States. When I went to spend time with the Choctaw Nation this summer, I went with a story in my mind. I came with the story. These are people who have been oppressed. They have experienced extreme injustice. They are victims. They, yeah, that there's like a centering of a like, this horrible thing has happened to this people, and we want to center that. And that is true. There's truth to that story. And yet, the Choctaw people tell their story differently. When a Choctaw person tells the story of their painful, forced relocation, they tell the story of their people as resilient, as capable of overcoming extreme injustice, oppression, and adversity. A people who had faith in God and saw his faithfulness in their painful parts of their story and their new home making in what is now Oklahoma. And so both perspectives, there's truth, right? But the facts are the same about what happened to the Choctaw people, but the story that the Choctaw tells frames their existence as a resilient people, as a people overcoming adversity, as a people beloved by God and preserved by God. They're framing a resilience and a strength and a faith, even though the facts are the same. So I think this is true about all of our communities. There's not only two stories, but there could be many ways that we frame the stories. So the facts may be the same, but what we're believing about the story changes everything, right? So stories have value and purpose, and they inform us. They're a vehicle for remembering. They draw out the facts, what actually happened, right? And then making meaning from how that happened is part of your community's invitation in these tools even. Stories give space for people to share, and it can be validating and empowering for people to be heard and to tell their story. And stories are also connecting, right? They build our community. When we're heard and when we hear, it reminds us of our shared human experience, and it builds bonds of connection in our community. It honors the elders in our community, and it teaches the young people who are going to continue the community's path forward. The more we tell stories, the more we hear stories in our community, the more we are connected, the more we can empathize, the more we can move forward in a unified vision toward flourishing as a community. So there's a tool that we love that can help draw this out. And that tool is called Appreciative Interviewing. And this tool is just all about getting curious, asking questions, learning more about a person in your community, their story, their history, interests, hopes, and so much more. The tool is fairly simple, but it is so powerful. It's all about just giving you the tools to ask good questions and listen well to one another in your community. So the word appreciate has two different meanings. Okay, one is just like having gratitude for, giving value to something. I appreciate this about you. The other meaning is about adding up and increasing value. Over time, value is appreciated and accumulated. And we think that this word applies to this tool. It's both about gratitude and value and accumulating and adding. This tool is, it's a strategy that can be used in your community. And you can do this in pairs. You can do this in small groups. You can do this in a placemat setting. When we come together in our call next week, we will talk about ways you can implement this tool. But it's a process of collecting qualitative information to form stories. The objective is to understand the force behind something instead of just the facts of the story, thinking back to the Choctaw story. When communities are asked to recall their stories of strength and resilience, it makes space for the community to imagine the great possibilities for the future. Stories and experiences give us such insight to underlying forces that cause ourselves and our communities to be who we are, and it also reveals what we value. So the content of this tool. As a facilitator, it's your task to come up with the questions that you know will motivate your community. But here's just an example of some questions you could ask to kind of draw out story in your community. So you could try asking, tell a story or share a time when you were really proud of our community. Share about a time when somebody was an unexpected leader in your community. Share about a time when your community overcame something challenging. Share about what brings life to your community. There's a couple of other examples there, and I'll let you read those slides, and we'll send this tool out to you. But it's powerful. It's just the idea of making space to ask questions that get your community thinking about the forces behind the facts of the story. To transition us to our next tool, which Jamie's going to teach us, the timeline. Last week, I was with the Navajo Nation, and one of the elders was talking about the importance of elders. The idea that there are people who have lived for decades longer and they have wisdom to share. They want to pass along what they've learned so we can build on what generations prior learned and discovered as a community. So the invitation to invite those that have been in our community for decades, to invite the elders into the conversation is so powerful and is such an enriching experience. And so Jamie's going to take it away with our next tool.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Some of you are familiar with this tool, the timeline. It's a really fun exercise and a way for really people to tell stories. Do it in a way that's a little bit more organized and in a way that's a little bit more collaborative. So instead of just telling individual stories independent from each other, it's a way to integrate these stories together into a larger community story. And so it starts out with the chronology and laying out some dates. You got to think about, well, when does our story really begin? Maybe it's 50 years ago, maybe it's 100 years ago. And we're going to draw a timeline on the wall so we can reflect on these things. It's important at the beginning to think about a theme. And often when we start, it's just general and it's quite simple just to think about major events that have happened in this community. And some are really good and hopeful and promising, and some are more challenging and difficult and things that, we've suffered or struggled with in the past. And so, often the theme is just the highs and lows of this community. But another way to do it is just to think about the highs and lows in each person's life. And in the context of their community, what have they gone through? And so maybe it's a church community and you're reflecting on individual lives, or maybe you're reflecting on the life of the church. This is a time when, we had a new pastor arrive. And then another time there was a death in the community. We lost someone very dear to us, and we suffered through that. We moved to a new building. We grew by, 10 people, or, a certain Bible study was started. And so we start reflecting on all of these things, and we're building a story where each individual story is connected together. Maybe as you go along with the community, you can use the timeline in a more particular way. You could focus it on what are the development projects that we've achieved in the past. You could even focus on women. What have the women done in this church, and how has God been using them? Or even just thinking about God's faithfulness to the community. Tell a story about God's faithfulness, and let's look for his impactful love and direction through the course of this community's journey. And so I'm just going to walk you quickly through a process. The first one, as I mentioned, is just to choose some dates. And maybe you write lines in 10-year increments. You're just creating space for people to put their story up on the wall. But it's important to give them the right space in time that is needed for that story to appear. And then you have a decision. You can just ask them to write directly on the wall, on the piece of paper, or sticky notes sometimes is good if you have access to them, because then they have time to write it in front of them beforehand. And sometimes we'll say, well, you can try to write 5 or maybe try to write 10, depending on how many people there are. Try to make sure you write a few that are challenges and a few that are more positive examples, stories. And so that's up to you, and you can sort of think about how you want to approach that. And then you have a chance for each person to put their sticky notes up on the wall and maybe tell their story, 3, 4, 5 minutes each to go through their sticky notes. And, sometimes you could even try to give them one color so it's easier to follow their sticky notes on the wall. But, I've even done these timelines with a stick drawn in the dirt on the ground. I remember doing that in Africa, and everybody just gathered around the ground and talking about events that had happened with no paper at all. So you really have the flexibility to use this as it works for you. I think it's really important during this process that there's 1 or 2 people that are going to write down some themes as they reflect on the big picture of what's happening. What are some themes that are coming out throughout this process? Some unifying ideas that are drawing people together. Maybe there's even a scripture reference or a unifying story, something to reflect on. We were just in India, Daniela and I, not too long ago, and a theme came out that was the wounded healer, the wounded healer. And I think that was something that was helpful to unify the group around an idea of where are we going together based on where have we come from and what are we passionate about. And so then the most important thing is then to take time to reflect after everyone's shared and you've gone through this exercise. What does everybody see? And more importantly, what is the relevance to our lives and our future together? And so really the timeline is meant to dig up and excavate the passion in the community, the identity of the community. Who are we? Where have we come from? What has God put us here for? And so back to the example of the church in Eastern Congo that said, wow, God has gifted us as ministers of reconciliation. We are the peace church. We understand conflict. Yes, we've been through it. We can help people in our community to mitigate conflict, to deal with conflict, and to come out on the other side with wholeness and healing. And what a thing to discover. I remember doing this with my own church in Canada. And at that time, there was a lot of different ideas of where we should go and should we try to make our own building? We had been moving from school gyms to other school gyms and didn't really have a space. And God reminded us through this timeline process that we are a pilgrim people, which is a metaphor in the Bible of people always on the move and kept in a humble posture, faithful to God. And we recognize that was God's calling for us. And what a change for us to see that we don't have to get caught up in raising money and buying buildings and things like that, but recognize that we're okay trusting God to be a pilgrim people moving from place to place. I want to mention one final thing about the timeline. It was something that came up in Southeast Asia, and someone mentioned that there's 2 things that are in the ground, and when we're mining and digging, and in that place, that back in the 70s and 80s, there was war, and it was a whole generation of war, and many landmines were planted. And so literally in the soil, there is explosives. But the other thing is there's seeds of opportunity. So two things as you walk along the earth, two things that are there that you don't even notice. Seeds that have the opportunity to grow into something, and landmines that have the risk of exploding and destroying life. But the point is that both are important. Both are important to excavate. If we are going to be able to take advantage of the land and the space that God's given us. And so, what are the landmines? Well, the landmines are the potential conflict in the community. The landmines are the relationships that are at odds with each other in the community. The landmines are past experiences in our community that we haven't dealt with properly yet. And they're inhibiting us as a community from moving forward collectively in love into the future. And so both of those are opportunities. And as we move forward in this facilitation and training, we talk more about conflict and we talk more about reconciling together. And the fact is that no community has an opportunity to develop anything if they can't deal with conflict. And so this timeline is an opportunity to unearth both of those things, seeds for opportunity and landmines as well. And so don't be afraid to dig up those more difficult subjects and those difficult conversations, provided you have the tools to really begin to deal with those things. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to Daniela.
Great. Yeah, the next tool that I want to share with you is called Rhythms of Our Culture. This tool highlights all the special rhythm and identity of our community. It's another way to think about, like Jamie had talked about, like, who are we? How do we move? How are we being in life? And it's all about how you as a community uniquely relate to one another. When you are then harnessing and activating and mobilizing, is it going with the rhythm of who you are? For so long, other cultures and countries have actually come into our communities and wanted us to beat to their rhythm. And it has caused some of us to lose our own unique rhythm. So this tool is all about activating identity and rhythms that we move to, so that when we think about activities and initiatives and mobilization, we are sure that it fits into our community's rhythm. I can think about a time when there was a community in Africa where a pipe was made that went into the town where they could pump water right in the middle of the town. And everybody thought, oh, this is so wonderful. Now the women don't have to walk like a kilometer to go get water and come back. And actually, the women were very upset because this disturbed their rhythm, which was to walk with each other to the well. And in this time, they connected with each other. They felt empowered by one another. Often they were really suppressed. So this is the time they could just be themselves with each other. And that pipe, it destroyed that. It didn't fit into their rhythm. So this tool is all about finding the unique rhythm that brings our community together and actually brings life to our community. So I'm going to describe this tool as if I was going to do this in a community. It's easier for me to do it that way. So if you want, you could even pause this video as a leadership team and actually do this tool along with me. So you could just play and then pause and then play and then pause. You will need chart paper. You'll need 5 pieces of chart paper. And at the top of them, you're going to have work on one, play on another, traditions, celebrate, and organize. And you're going to need markers. So if I was going to start this in my community, this is how I would do it. Let's talk about rhythms. This is a really difficult concept to grasp for many people, but I like to think about it in terms of music. When you think about rhythm, you think about music. Rhythm is music's pattern in time. Wherever I've been in the world, there's a unique style of music and rhythm to that music. For example, Canada is known for a style of music called folk music. You can get into the details of the kind of beats and instruments and timing that's used for this particular type of music. But even if you don't know all those details, when you hear it, you know it's that kind of music. Why? Because it's a particular and unique rhythm. And I'm sure you can think about this for the music of your culture. Now, our community also has a rhythm, and I'm not talking about a musical rhythm. So I want to ask you, when you think about the word rhythm, how would you describe it? And I would pose that question to the group. You might have said beats, flow, movement, patterns, pulses, tempos, vibrations. I would then ask the community, so how does our community have a rhythm? If that's what rhythm means, if that's the definition of rhythm, how does our community have a rhythm? So they might give you answers like they have certain patterns of working with one another, or they might give answers like they have a certain flow, a familiarity in the way they function together. Maybe they might start even talking about particular rhythms in their own culture. For example, the Amish people might talk about this rhythm of barn raising, where they all come together when they need a new barn. The whole community, it doesn't matter. They know if this person needs a barn, everybody's going to go and help build it, because the next time when it's our turn, we do it. And there's this rhythm of working together in that way. Or in Kenya, they even have an actual word that describes the rhythm of their community. It's called harambi. I'm probably saying that wrong, and I'm sorry. But it's this concept, because rhythm can also be like a concept of everybody pulling together for self-help events. I think about my own community, and we have a word that we call potluck. And that's this idea of celebrating together, this rhythm of everyone bringing a type of food together so that we can have a nice party. In Ethiopia, they have something called adirs. It's actually a structure or an organizational rhythm, which at first was intended to just be to help people with money in order to bury their loved ones. But it ended up becoming more of a society together that if you're part of an adir, it's this network of trust where you help each other out financially. Now, think about your own community, and let's get a little bit our own community, because I'm pretending that I'm doing this for you. I want you to think about your own community and get a little bit more specific. And we're going to look at those chart papers that I just put on the wall. And you'll see those words of work, play, traditions, celebrate or festivals, and organize. I'm going to break you all up into small groups, and I'm going to send you to each one of those chart papers. So depending on how many of you there are, there might be 2 people per chart, there might be 3. You don't even have to have everybody up with stories that represent how they can be answered. So for the first one, we're going to ask, what are the rhythms or familiar patterns or the flow of how we as a community work together? So I gave the example of the Amish barn raising. How do we as a community, what are ways and rhythms that we work together as a community? How do the women work together? How do the men work together? How do different parts of society work together? How do we as a whole community, what is our beat? Like in Canada, it's this idea of 9 to 5, and everybody knows you can't plan things between 9 and 5 because our rhythm is from 9 rhythm of working, and when you take breaks and when you work. The second question would be, so the second chart paper is, what are the rhythms of how we play together? And I know in many cultures, there's this idea of particular sports, particular games that bring us all together, that where we have life together. When we were in India, I know that this time of soccer at a certain time of the night was when the young people would come together and there was connection between community members. So what are the ways that your community have rhythms of playing and having fun with each other? Could be even to do with eating with each other. Next, what are some of the rhythms of tradition that we do together? So these are more thinking about ways that we deal with people being born, people dying, marriages, traditions of how we come to a meeting and work together, and like different age generations having traditions with each other, and how you respect your elders. What are the traditions and rhythms? You can think of this in many, many ways. Next, what are some of the rhythms in how we celebrate with each other? This could be things like festivals, religious celebrations, babies being born, showers, and maybe like wedding celebrations or birthdays. What is the rhythm of celebrating? Is it like in a year, the different times of year? Is it depending on the people and who it is? What are our rhythms of celebrating? And lastly, what are the rhythms of how we organize together? So is there particular political structures? Is there particular social structures? I talked about the Ethiopian Adir system, which is a real rhythm of how they organize with each other. So you would give the group about 10 minutes at each chart paper, making sure that each group has been to each one. And then you're going to get a list of a bunch of different stories. And it's now a time, just as you did in the timeline, to start reflecting, to start celebrating, to start just, I think after you do something like this, you can feel confident as a group and like together as a group about who we are and our identity and being proud of that. So we ask ourselves, what does this say about who we are and how we understand ourselves differently because of it? And then how are we going to move and act based on these rhythms? What are we going to allow to come in, and what are we going to allow for ourselves to like move out in? We can ask ourselves, where do we see strengths of who we are as a community? What makes us strong in each one of these categories? And where are there some ideas about how it can affect what kind of initiatives we do in our community? And asking ourselves, do our initiatives fit the rhythms of our community? As churches, like, are what you're doing, is it going to actually fit with the way the community around you beats? I don't know. Sometimes we forget these things. And so I think it's really important to talk about what is the pattern and the rhythm of our community.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That is a great tool. So these are just 3 tools for this Discoverable. There's actually quite a bit more that we have. If you're interested in more resources, we have them, but we wanted to keep it to these 3. I'll close with a quote from Patty Dye. She says, "The quickest way between 2 people is a story." I love that. It's like a very quick connection point. And so all of these 3 storytelling tools are such a great launch point for your community as you begin the CCD process with them. We're looking forward to being together in a couple of days. Bless you guys, and we will see you soon.